Cowboy saves Apache woman from the cliff. Now they must survive with one shared enemy. The sun was low in the sky, turning the rocky land orange and gold. A lone cowboy named Thomas rode slowly along a narrow trail. His horse stepped carefully over stones and dry bushes. The land was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind moved softly, carrying dust and the smell of dry earth. Thomas had traveled this land many times, but today something felt different. The air felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Thomas was not a man who scared easily. He had lived a hard life on the frontier. He knew how dangerous the land could be. Wild animals, rough weather, and bad people were all part of his world. Still, he trusted his instincts. When something felt wrong, he paid attention. He stopped his horse near a tall rock formation called Eagle Rock. The cliff dropped sharply into a deep valley below. Many people avoided this place because one wrong step could mean the end. Thomas had brought his cattle through nearby trails before, but today he was alone, checking paths and water sources. As he looked out over the edge, he heard something. At first he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again. A faint sound. A human sound. It was a cry. Thomas froze. He turned his head, listening carefully. The sound came again, weak and full of fear. It was coming from somewhere near the cliff. He tied his horse quickly and moved on foot, stepping slowly so loose stones would not fall. As he got closer, the sound became clearer. It was a woman's voice. Thomas moved faster, his heart beating harder. When he reached a narrow ledge near the cliff, he saw her. A young Apache woman was lying close to the edge. Her clothes were torn and dirty. There was dried blood on her arm and face. Her hands were gripping the ground as if she had almost fallen. Her eyes were wide with fear and pain. She looked exhausted, like she had been running for a long time. For a moment, both of them stared at each other. She tried to pull herself back, thinking he might be another danger. Fear filled her face. Thomas raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly. "But I'm not here to hurt you." She did not understand his words, but she understood his tone. Still, she did not trust him. Her body shook, and she looked past him as if she expected someone else to appear at any second. Thomas carefully stepped closer. The edge of the cliff was only a few feet away from her. One small movement, and she could slip. He saw that her leg was injured. She could not stand on her own. That meant she had been hurt badly and still kept moving. That took strength. Thomas slowly reached out his hand. "Let me help," he said. "Diet's mind. Diet's mind. Diet's mind." She hesitated. Her eyes moved from his face to his hand. Then she looked back toward the land behind her, fear returning to her eyes. Whatever she was running from scared her more than he did. Finally, she placed her hand in his. Thomas grabbed her firmly and pulled her away from the edge. He braced his feet against the rock and used all his strength. It was not easy, but he managed to pull her to safer ground. Once she was away from the cliff, she collapsed onto the rocky soil, breathing hard. For a moment, Thomas just stood there, catching his breath. He had almost lost his balance himself. One mistake and both of them could have fallen. The woman lay on her side, weak and shaking. Thomas knelt near her, keeping a respectful distance. He took off his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You're safe for now," he said quietly. She did not understand the words, but she saw that he was not attacking. Still, fear did not leave her face. She tried to sit up, but pain made her wince. She grabbed her leg and closed her eyes tightly. Thomas noticed her injury more clearly now. Her leg was swollen, and her arm had deep scratches. She had clearly been through something terrible. He pointed gently to her leg and then to the ground, trying to show she should rest. He made slow movements, hoping she would understand. She watched him carefully. After a few seconds, she nodded slightly and stayed still. Thomas looked around. The land was too open. If someone had been chasing her, they could still be nearby. He did not hear horses, but that did not mean danger was gone. He knew they could not stay there. He pointed toward a narrow canyon not far away, where rocks formed a small natural shelter. Water sometimes flowed there after rain. It would be a better place to hide. He pointed to himself, then to her, then toward the canyon. She followed his gesture with her eyes. She seemed unsure, but she also seemed too tired to argue. Slowly she tried to stand. Pain shot through her, and she almost fell again. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward and supported her. She stiffened at first, but then she leaned on him because she had no choice. Together they moved slowly, step by step, toward the canyon. Thomas could feel how light she was. She had not eaten enough. Her breathing was shallow, and she was clearly close to collapsing. When they reached the canyon, Thomas helped her sit on a flat rock near the shade. The air felt cooler there. It was quieter, too. The tall rock walls blocked sound and sight from far away. Thomas gave her his water canteen. He opened it and held it out. She hesitated, then took it. She drank carefully at first, then more deeply. Water spilled down her chin, and she wiped it away with shaking hands. Thomas watched quietly. He felt a strong sense of responsibility. He did not know who she was or why she was being hunted, but he knew one thing. Leaving her alone out here would be a death sentence. She handed the canteen back and said something softly in her own language. Her voice was weak, but full of emotion. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It was thanks. It was also fear. It was pain. He nodded gently. "You're welcome," he said. He took out a small cloth from his saddlebag and dampened it with water. Slowly he offered it to her and pointed to the blood on her face. She allowed him to help. He cleaned her face carefully, not touching more than needed. She flinched at first, then relaxed slightly. For the first time, Thomas noticed how young she looked. She could not have been much older than 20. Her eyes were dark and strong, even through the pain. There was something brave in her expression. Thomas pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said clearly. She watched his lips and then pointed to herself. "Ayanna," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "Ayanna," he repeated. She seemed to relax just a little, hearing her name spoken. The canyon felt still, but danger was not far away. Thomas could feel it. He stood and carefully looked out toward the open land. Nothing moved, but that did not mean they were safe. Ayanna watched him closely.
She touched her chest and then made a motion like running. Her face showed fear.
Then she made a gesture like people coming after her. Thomas understood enough. She was being chased. His jaw tightened. He did not like trouble, but he hated the idea of leaving someone helpless even more. He looked back at her and spoke slowly.
"I won't leave you," he said, even though he knew she could not fully understand. But she looked into his eyes, and something in his face must have told her the truth.
Her shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time since he had found her, she allowed herself to rest. The sun continued to lower in the sky. Shadows grew longer. Night would come soon. Thomas knew that night travel was dangerous, but staying in one place was worse. Whoever had chased her might still be searching. As Ayana leaned against the rock, trying to gather strength, Thomas made a quiet promise to himself. Whatever danger was coming, he would face it with her. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because some moments in life gave no other choice. And this was one of those moments. Night came slowly, covering the land with deep blue shadows. The canyon grew cooler, and the air felt heavy and still. Thomas sat close to Ayana but kept a respectful distance. He did not want to scare her. He kept his rifle nearby, not in his hands, but close enough in case danger came. The quiet of the canyon made every small sound feel loud. Ayana leaned against the rock wall, her eyes half closed. She was clearly exhausted. Her breathing was slow but steady. The pain in her leg had made her weak, and the long escape had taken almost all her strength. Thomas took out a small piece of dried meat and bread from his bag. He broke it in half and slowly offered her a piece. At first, she shook her head. Maybe she did not trust the food, or maybe she felt too tired to eat. Thomas did not push. He placed the food on a flat rock near her, then sat back. After a few minutes, Ayana picked up the bread and meat. She smelled it, then took a small bite. Her eyes closed for a second as she chewed. Hunger had been hurting her for a long time. Slowly, she ate more. Thomas watched quietly, feeling a small sense of relief. Food would give her strength. She would need every bit of it. They could not speak much to each other. Their words were different, and only simple signs helped. Still, small moments created understanding. A nod, a slow smile, a careful look. Thomas pointed to the sky and then to the land ahead, trying to show that they would move when it was darker and cooler. Ayana nodded slightly. She understood that moving in daylight was dangerous. When the moon rose, the land outside the canyon glowed softly. Shadows stretched across the rocks. Thomas stood and looked out again. Still, no sign of anyone. But he did not trust the quiet. He returned and gently touched the rock near Ayana's hand to get her attention. Then he pointed toward the narrow trail leading deeper into the canyon and beyond. She understood. She tried to stand. Pain hit her again. She grabbed the rock wall to steady herself. Her face tightened, and a small sound escaped her lips. Thomas moved closer without thinking and offered his arm again. This time, she did not pull away. She leaned on him, and together they moved slowly. Every step was careful. Thomas adjusted his pace to match hers. He could feel how much she depended on him now. The trail was narrow and uneven. Rocks shifted under their boots. More than once, Thomas had to steady her to keep her from falling. Each time, her grip on his arm grew stronger. They moved deeper into the land, away from Eagle Rock. The canyon opened into a wider area filled with tall grass and low trees. It was a better place to hide tracks and sounds. Thomas bent down and brushed away some of their footprints where he could. He had learned these skills from years on the trail. He knew how people followed signs. He wanted to make it harder for anyone to find them. Ayana watched him carefully. She seemed to understand what he was doing. At one point, she pointed to a rocky path and then to a patch of dry stream bed. She showed him another way. Thomas realized that she knew the land too. They began to help each other in small ways. Thomas used his knowledge of hiding tracks. Ayana used her knowledge of secret paths and natural cover. Even without many words, they were working as a team. They stopped near a small group of trees where the ground was softer. Thomas helped her sit on a fallen log. He checked her leg again. It was still swollen, and she winced when he touched near the injury. He tore a clean strip of cloth from his spare shirt and gently wrapped her leg to give it some support. He worked slowly and carefully. Ayanna watched his face. She could see that he was trying to help, not hurt. When he finished, she softly touched his arm and said something in her language. Her voice was full of feeling. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood her eyes. Trust was slowly replacing fear. They rested for a while. The night insects filled the air with soft sounds. The stars were bright above them. Thomas pointed to himself again, and then made a sleeping motion. Ayanna nodded. She leaned back against the log, trying to rest. Thomas stayed awake, watching the land around them. As time passed, Thomas noticed Ayanna stirring. She seemed uneasy. She looked around and then pointed to her chest, her eyes showing deep sadness. She spoke quietly, her voice shaking. Thomas could not understand the language, but he understood pain when he saw it. She touched the ground and then made a wide motion with her hands, as if showing many people. Then she made a motion like fire and people running. Her eyes filled with tears. Thomas realized she was trying to tell him what had happened. Her village, her family, whatever had happened to them had been terrible. Thomas felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had seen bad things in his life, but seeing the pain in her eyes made it more real. He lowered his head for a moment in respect. Then he looked back at her. "I'm sorry," he said softly. She may not have understood the words, but she understood his tone. She placed her hand over her heart and closed her eyes for a moment. The silence between them was full of shared sorrow. Later, Thomas heard something, a distant sound. Horses, very faint but real. His body went still. He raised his hands slowly to signal Ayanna to be quiet. Her eyes widened when she saw the change in his face. He leaned close and whispered, even though he knew she might not understand. "Quiet, stay low." She understood enough. They both lowered themselves behind the trees and tall grass. Thomas gently pulled her closer to the ground to hide her shape. His heart beat loudly in his chest. The sound of horses grew a little clearer, then softer again. It was hard to tell how close they were. Thomas held his breath. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, the sound faded. Thomas stayed still for a long time, just to be sure. When he was certain the danger had passed, he slowly relaxed. Ayanna looked at him with fear still in her eyes. Thomas shook his head slowly and gave a small, calm gesture, trying to show that for now they were safe. But both of them knew the truth. This was not over. Whoever had chased her was still out there, and now Thomas was part of it. As the night grew deeper, Thomas made another promise in his heart. He would not turn back. Not now. Not when her life depended on it. And in the quiet darkness, two strangers from different worlds continued forward, connected by danger, trust, and the strong will to survive. The sky slowly changed from deep blue to soft gray. Morning was coming. Thomas had not slept much. He had stayed alert through the night, listening for sounds, watching shadows, and making sure Ayanna was safe. When the first light touched the land, he gently woke her. She opened her eyes slowly, still tired and in pain, but stronger than before. The food and rest had helped a little. Thomas handed her the water canteen again. She drank and nodded quietly in thanks. They could not stay long in one place. Morning made it easier for people to follow tracks. Thomas knew this well. He pointed toward the east and then made a walking motion. Ayanna understood. Before moving, Ayanna knelt on the ground and touched the dirt with her fingers. She studied it closely. Then she looked up and pointed toward a rocky ridge in the distance. She made a sign with her hand, showing people moving. Thomas watched her carefully. He realized she was reading the land, just like him. She was showing him that others had passed nearby. His face grew serious. They were getting closer. They moved slowly, staying near rocks and trees whenever possible. Thomas led when the land was open. Ayanna guided when the path became narrow and hidden. Their teamwork was growing stronger with every mile. At one point, they found a burned area of land. Blackened wood and cold ashes covered the ground. The smell of smoke still faintly remained. Thomas stopped and looked around. He knelt and touched the ashes. They were not very old. Ayanna's face changed when she saw it. Her hands trembled slightly. She stepped forward and looked at the burned ground with deep pain in her eyes. She spoke softly, her voice full of emotion. She touched her chest, then the burned land. Thomas understood. This was connected to what happened to her people. His jaw tightened. He had seen burned ranches before. He knew what kind of men did this kind of thing. It was not an accident. It was done on purpose. Thomas looked around and noticed tracks near the burned area. Boot prints, horse tracks, many of them. He followed one set of tracks a short distance and then returned. "They're close," he said quietly. Ayanna did not understand the words, but she saw the meaning on his face. They moved on, faster now, even though it hurt her leg. Ayanna tried not to show her pain, but Thomas could see it. Still, she pushed forward. Fear was giving her strength. As they traveled, Thomas noticed signs he recognized: a broken fence, a trampled water hole, a ranch marker cut down. These were signs of a group he had heard about, a dangerous gang. They moved from place to place, taking what they wanted, hurting people, and leaving nothing but fear behind. Thomas had seen their work from a distance before, but now he realized something important. This same group was connected to both his world and Ayanna's world. They were the shared enemy. Thomas stopped near a rock ledge and sat Ayanna down to rest. He took out a small piece of charcoal from a burned stick and drew simple shapes on a flat rock. He drew a group of people. Then he drew fire. Then he drew horses. He pointed to the drawing, and then to the land. Ayanna watched closely. Her eyes filled with understanding and sadness. She nodded slowly. She pointed to the people he drew, and then made a cutting motion across her hand. Her face showed anger and pain. Thomas nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Same people. Even without shared language, they understood each other clearly now. They were both hurt by the same group. This changed something between them. They were no longer just helping a stranger. They were standing against a common danger. They moved again, using a hidden path Ayanna showed him. It ran between tall rocks and thick brush. The path was hard to see, but it was perfect for staying hidden. At one point, Thomas heard voices far away, not clear words, but human sounds. Laughter. Shouting. He pulled Ayanna down behind a large rock. They stayed still. The voices moved closer, then passed by at a distance. Thomas could see shadows moving on a ridge. Riders. Ayanna held her breath. Her hand gripped Thomas's sleeve tightly. He stayed very still, hoping his calm would help her. After a long time, the riders moved away. Thomas slowly relaxed. They were walking in the middle of danger now. As the day went on, Ayanna became more tired. Her leg was slowing her down. Thomas knew they needed a safer place to rest. They found a small hidden valley with trees, rocks, and a narrow stream. The water was clear and cold. It was a good place to hide for a short time. Thomas helped Ayanna sit near the water. He cleaned her leg again and tightened the cloth wrap to give better support. She watched him with quiet gratitude. She then pointed to the stream and made a small cup shape with her hands, showing that water could be used to hide their trail. Thomas smiled slightly. "Smart," he said. They both stepped in the water for a short distance, walking upstream before stepping out onto rocks. This would make it harder for anyone to track them. Their teamwork was growing stronger. Later, as they rested, Ayanna pointed to her chest and then made a small circle with her hands, like a home. She pointed toward the distant hills. Thomas understood. There were other survivors. Other people like her who were still hiding. Thomas felt a strong sense of purpose. This was no longer just about saving one person. This was about protecting many. He nodded firmly. "I'll help," he said, even if she did not fully understand. She looked into his eyes. Something strong passed between them. Trust, shared purpose, shared danger. As the sun moved lower, Thomas and Ayanna prepared to move again. They were tired, hurt, and hunted. But they were no longer alone. They were no longer strangers. They were two people from different worlds, walking the same dangerous path, facing the same enemy, and they both knew that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. The sun was low again, painting the land with soft orange light. Thomas and Ayanna moved carefully through a narrow pass between tall rock walls. The air felt heavy, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. Their journey had become harder. Hunger, pain, and fear were wearing them down, but neither of them was ready to give up. Ayanna's leg was still hurting. Even with the cloth wrap, every step caused pain. She tried not to show it, but Thomas could see it in her face. Still, she kept moving. Her strength came from more than her body. It came from her will to survive. Thomas slowed his pace to match hers. He pointed to a rock ledge where they could rest for a moment. Ayanna nodded and carefully sat down. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. Thomas checked the land around them. The pass was narrow, which made it easier to hide, but also dangerous if someone followed them inside. There would be no easy way to escape. He knelt near Ayanna and gave her a small piece of dried food. She ate slowly. Each bite gave her a little more strength. As they rested, Thomas heard a distant sound, not wind, not animals. Horses. This time they were closer. Thomas's body went still. He raised his hand to signal Ayanna to stay quiet. Her eyes widened with fear. She could hear it too now. The sound of hooves echoed softly between the rocks. They were being followed. Thomas helped Ayanna stand and guided her toward a small opening in the rock wall. It was barely wide enough for two people to squeeze through. Inside, there was a narrow space that led to a shallow cave. They moved inside just in time. The cave was dark and cool. Thomas guided Ayanna to sit and pressed his finger to his lips, showing her to stay silent. Outside, the sound of horses grew louder. Voices could be heard now. Not clear words, but human voices. The sound of men talking and laughing. Ayanna's breathing became fast and shallow. Thomas gently placed his hand near her shoulder, not touching, but close enough to show calm. He slowly breathed in and out, hoping she would follow his rhythm. She tried. They waited. The riders stopped nearby. Thomas could see shadows moving across the ground outside the cave. Boots stepped close. so close that Thomas could hear small stones shifting. His heart felt like it was beating in his ears. One rider dismounted. The sound of leather and metal filled the air. Someone walked slowly near the cave entrance. Ayanna closed her eyes tightly, her hands shaking. Thomas held his breath. For a long moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Then the footsteps moved away. The riders talked again, their voices drifting farther. Finally, the sound of horses slowly faded. Thomas stayed still for a long time, just to be sure. When he was certain they were gone, he slowly relaxed his shoulders. Ayanna opened her eyes. Tears filled them, but she did not cry out. She was strong, but the fear had shaken her deeply. Thomas looked at her with respect. They had survived another close call, but danger was getting closer. They could not keep running forever. When they left the cave, the light was softer. Evening was near. They moved quietly, staying low and hidden. Not long after, Thomas slipped on loose rock and fell hard on his side. A sharp pain shot through his arm and shoulder. He gritted his teeth and tried to stand, but pain made him stumble. Ayanna rushed to his side without thinking. She helped him sit against a rock. Her face was full of concern. She gently touched his arm and shoulder, checking where he was hurt. Thomas tried to wave her off, but she shook her head. She had seen him help her many times. Now it was her turn. She carefully checked his arm. It was bruised and sore, but not broken. Still, he was clearly hurt. Ayanna tore a clean strip from her clothing and wrapped it gently around his arm for support. Her hands were steady, even though her own body was tired and injured. Thomas watched her, surprised and deeply moved. "You're helping me now," he said softly. She looked up and gave a small, tired smile. For the first time, their roles had changed. They were truly depending on each other now. As night came, they found a small, hidden area surrounded by rocks and bushes. It was not perfect, but it would do for a short rest. They shared the last of their food. The portions were small, but they ate slowly, making it last. The stars came out again, bright and cold. Thomas sat awake while Ayanna rested. His arm hurt, and his body felt heavy, but his mind stayed alert. He thought about everything that had happened. He had started this journey alone. Now he was responsible for another life. But it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. Later, Ayanna woke and sat beside him. She pointed to his arm and made a sad face. Thomas gave a small smile to show he was okay. She then pointed to her heart and then to him. It was a simple gesture, but it meant something deep. They were no longer just travelers. They were partners in survival. The next day, their situation became even harder. The land grew rougher. Water was harder to find. Ayanna's legs slowed her more. Thomas's arm made it harder for him to stay strong. They had to stop more often. Each stop was a risk. At one point, they saw smoke far away. Not cooking smoke. Thick, dark smoke. Thomas knew what it meant. More trouble. More people being hurt. Ayanna watched the smoke with deep sadness. Her face showed that this pain was not new to her. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. This was not right. No one should have to live like this. He looked at Ayanna and spoke with quiet strength. "We'll get through this." She may not have understood the words, but she understood his eyes. They moved on, tired but determined. Every step was a fight. Against pain, against fear, against a world that seemed to be pushing them down. But they kept going, because stopping meant giving up, and neither of them was ready to give up. In the middle of danger, hunger, and pain, something strong had grown between them. Not just trust, not just teamwork, but a deep understanding. They had become each other's reason to keep going. And as the enemy closed in, Thomas and Ayanna prepared themselves for whatever was coming next. They knew the hardest test was still ahead, but they would face it. Together, the morning air felt cold and heavy. A pale light spread across the land as Thomas and Ayanna prepared to move again. Their bodies were tired and their supplies were low, but their minds were clear. They both knew that this day would be different. The danger was closer than ever, and the choices they made now would decide what happened next. Thomas studied the land carefully. He noticed a wide valley ahead and a narrow trail leading toward a rocky ridge. An idea formed in his mind. If he could draw the riders away, Ayanna might be able to reach safer ground and find her people. He knelt and drew simple shapes in the dirt. He drew two paths. He pointed to one and then to himself. Then he pointed to the other and then to Ayanna. She understood. Her eyes widened in fear. She shook her head quickly. She did not want to leave him. Thomas gently held up his hand to calm her. He pointed to her heart, then to the distant hills, then made a group motion with his hands. He was telling her to go to her people. Tears filled her eyes. She grabbed his arm, shaking her head again. Thomas looked at her with strong, calm eyes. "This is how we win," he said softly. She may not have understood the words, but she understood his meaning. Slowly, with great pain, she nodded. They stayed close for a moment, both knowing this might be the last time they saw each other. Then the sound of horses came again, closer, louder. No time left. Thomas pointed Ayanna toward the narrow hidden trail. He gave her one last firm nod. She touched his shoulder, and then her heart. Then she turned and disappeared into the rocks and brush. Thomas took a deep breath. Now it was his turn. He moved toward the open valley, making sure his tracks were easy to see. He rode his horse out into the open, not hiding, not careful. He wanted to be seen. Soon the riders spotted him. Shouts filled the air. Thomas did not look back. He rode hard, leading them away from the hidden path. The chase was long and exhausting. Dust filled the air. His arm hurt with every movement. His body screamed for rest, but he pushed forward. He used his knowledge of the land to stay just ahead. He led the riders through rough ground, rocky paths, and narrow turns. At one point, he led them toward a steep ridge where their horses had to slow down. This gave him a small lead. Thomas did not want to fight. He wanted to protect. Protect Ayanna. Protect the others. He kept riding until his horse was nearly spent. Finally, he reached a deep canyon with many twisting paths. He rode down one trail, then quickly turned and hid his tracks on rock. He led his horse into a shallow stream for a short distance, then climbed out on the other side and waited. The riders passed by, shouting and searching. Thomas stayed still, holding his breath. Slowly, one by one, they rode past. When the land became quiet again, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. He had done it. He had given Ayanna time. Time to escape. Time to live. Thomas stayed hidden until he was sure it was safe. Then he slowly made his way back toward the hills, moving carefully and quietly. The journey back was slow and painful. His body was weak. His arm still hurt. But his heart felt lighter. He did not know what had happened to Ayanna, but he believed. He believed she was strong. He believed she had made it. Days later, Thomas reached a small settlement area where travelers sometimes stopped. He rested there, getting food and water. One evening, as the sun set, he saw something that made his heart stop. In the distance, he saw a small group moving toward the hills. Among them was a familiar figure, Ayana. She was walking with others from her people. She was safe. She was alive. Thomas did not rush toward her. He stood quietly, watching. Ayana stopped suddenly, as if she felt something. She turned. Their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, the world felt silent. She smiled, a real smile, one full of life. She raised her hand. Thomas raised his in return. They did not need words. They had already said everything that mattered. Ayana turned back to her people and continued walking toward a safer future. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the land. He felt a mix of sadness and peace. Their journey together was over, but what they had shared would stay with him forever. He mounted his horse and turned toward his own path. He was no longer the same man who had ridden past Eagle Rock days before. He had learned that courage was not just about strength. It was about choice. It was about standing up for someone when the world was dangerous. It was about caring, even when it cost something. Thomas rode on, carrying the memory of a brave woman who had trusted him, and the knowledge that, even in the hardest lands, people from different worlds could stand together. And somewhere in those hills, Ayana carried the same memory. 2 lives changed. One shared enemy weakened, and a future made possible because 2 strangers chose to protect each other.